To be here. A quick background, I'm Jeff Seibert. I'm the founder and CEO of Digits. We make AI accounting a reality. Digits is the first complete QuickBooks replacement in almost 20 years. Our goal is to automate 90+% of your bookkeeping so you can focus on what really matters, which is actually building your business. Digits is my third venture-backed company. I was previously the founder and CEO of Crashlytics and head of consumer product at Twitter. But today, I'm honored to be joined by a legendary investor. Please join me in welcoming Peter Fenton to the stage. Thank you. I think many of you probably already know this, but Peter's the longest-serving partner at Benchmark, has been instrumental in the success of iconic companies like Twitter, New Relic, Zendesk, and has led a high-profile recent investments in Sierra, ClickHouse, Olama. His track record is stunning, with over 14 major exits, including 2 IPOs on the very same day in 2014. So maybe let's start with that moment. Early-stage founders, early-stage investors dream of that IPO moment, and you've had the fortune of seeing many of these over the years. How do you define success for yourself as an investor, for the founders, for the entrepreneurs you back?
That's a heavy question, so to just lighten the mood up a little bit before. First of all, I learned that I've worked with Jeff for probably 15 years on and off, and I always pronounce his last name Seibert. So I've learned that it's Seibert, not Seibert. The second thing is, let me tell you a story about Jeff. I'm going down to Big Sur. I'm actually flying down to Big Sur in a helicopter. I get this urgent call from Jeff. Oh, what is it? And he was running product at Twitter. And he said, I think we have a problem with the CEO. I was like, yeah, tell me about it. The CEO shall remain nameless. You could probably figure out who the CEO was. But I was like, well, what's the issue? And he says, I want to put a heart. When I like a tweet, I don't want it was a thumbs up back then.
It was a star.
It was a star. It's like, I want a heart. I want to express the emotional purity of love. And the founder says, that's too big of a change. and he's like, oh, what am I doing here? He was the head of product. And so you got a sense for the friction. As you guys build great companies, and they scale, and they succeed, you also build this sclerotic material, this inertia, the sacred cows. And it turns out Jeff was trying to slaughter the sacred cow of a star and replace it with a heart. You eventually won.
Well, we did win, and it's there today.
It's there today. Who here has hearted something today? That's Jeff Seibert. Thanks, Jeff Seibert. So you want to know, that is success. Persevering against all odds. He also decided that maybe it'd be nice to have more than 140 characters, built the entire product to do that, and it took Elon Musk to unleash that on the universe. So, but how do I define success? It's if you look at the cosmology of purpose, of what motivates people, what gets them out of the bed in the morning, it's heterogeneous, right? And so with founders, I find there's different mechanisms, different energetic sources. And some of them are more durable than others. And the ones that are most durable, I found, which is really what I'm going to speak about success, what I'm talking about, is that they tap into what, somewhat cliche now to call it, generative drive. And we have different things that motivate us. Sometimes it's to win. And if you've all read, if you haven't read, I highly recommend, although you probably won't get through it, James Carse's book, Finite and Infinite Games. Patrick Collison and Toby both recommended that book to me. Have I recommended that to you?
Not yet.
Now. It's required reading for any board that I'm on, starting now. That book articulates the difference in success as winning versus success as something that has a limitless horizon. And what you find in the market is you can actually sort companies between those that are playing the finite game of winning or products that are playing the finite game of winning versus those that are playing an infinite game. So infinite games, unlike finite games, don't have a defined winner or loser. They have flexible rules. And the point of an infinite game is to never finish playing. The best infinite game is the one we're all in this room as a byproduct of, which is evolution. You don't win evolution. You survive and reproduce, and the hope is you can do it another time. Although I have 5 kids, so I think I'm done. I'm not Elon Musk. What is success? If it's a finite game, for a lot of people, it's a number. It's a prize. You go to academia, I'm always struck by in academia the degree to which it's such a petty ecosystem of like what they really want is a Nobel Prize. What they really want is a award or something. But why? And well, because then my mom will know I was a good student. And all right, but is that really the goal? So success ultimately, I think, is, and this is the most important question that you face when you're starting a company, is that what is the source of your drive that will remain clean and have a limitless horizon? And if starting a company, you don't feel that, then you're not starting the right company. Keep looking. And I think the idea of success, when I look at it in scale, the IPO, when we're ringing the bell, whatever, I take no pleasure in that, because that's a prize, that's a finish line of the swords. But the great companies have no finish lines. They're playing infinite games. And purpose that's generative, what is generative? And again, this is somewhat cliche. People have talked about it. Paul Conti's written a lot about this. He's a psychiatrist up in Portland. It's the creative act or service towards a purpose greater than yourself. And ultimately success is that you're activating your generative drive. And for better or worse, if you're in a company, there is no finish line. There's no moment where you say, I've arrived, I've achieved success, because it's an infinite expanding universe of possibilities. And so the most successful companies we work with are defined by that sense of well-being, of creation and empowerment and insatiable desire. In the Silicon Valley, it does tend to uniquely come with a sense of dissatisfaction. You know, the most successful founders are the ones who'll tell you they've been, a great example of this. I said Toby at Shopify, which is, we'll talk about, my greatest miss, and he and I become good friends. And I thought back to, I could have bought a third of the company for $1 million. The fact that we don't lose our license to practice venture capital is truly amazing. But that's the equivalent of a pilot killing, 5,000 passengers. And you'd probably take them out of the cockpit, give them a blood test. And so I passed. I'm not alone in that. But anyway, so as I say to him, 2 years ago, congratulations, who would have thought that little company in rural Canada that you were running, Lou Cerny, who I just saw earlier today, had introduced me. Toby's makes you shiver with purpose. I mean, he's a German more than he's Canadian, so he's actually quite aggressive. And nothing against Canadians, but it's an issue. So I said to him, you must feel so different now that you've created a company that at the time was worth 150 billion. You've arrived, that's success. And I think most of us would say Toby was successful. And his response was like, don't say that to me. All I did was eke out a $150 billion market cap in a $2 trillion opportunity. So if you tell me I've been successful, that's like telling someone who got last place in a marathon, congratulations on winning. I've done nothing. I'm like, oh, all right, okay. That's a very Silicon Valley definition of success, is that it's always what's next. So that's
I would also extend this to the early stage, the beginning. So many people I talk to are like, my goal as the next step of my career is I want to start a company.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the wrong way to think about it. Like, starting the company should be the last possible step. It should be only because you're so irrationally obsessed with the idea that there's no other way to solve it.
I agree.
Like, starting the company isn't success, for sure.
No, it's the beginning of a life, hopefully something that's infinite.
So let's talk about that for a moment, because actually in 15 years, I've never asked you this. How did you originally get into VC? Your father was a startup CEO, investor. Was it something you always knew you wanted to do? What was sort of your first step?
Yeah, I mean, there's an Oedipal story that will bore the audience, but I'll give you the short form. As a kid growing up in I grew up in Portola Valley, Palo Alto area. My dad, I didn't see much. He was working his ass off as an entrepreneur would. Back then, entrepreneurs made like very little money, so we weren't well off. We didn't have people clean our house. I'm not complaining, but he talked about these people, these demigods, these diabolical forces of good, mostly evil, that would arrive with European sports cars, fancy clothing from Italy, and they were his boss. And as a child, I thought, I want to be that. They were called venture capitalists. And he fucking hated them. And they, like, the way he would describe with graphic detail every nose hair, every little flaw in their career. And of course, that seed was planted. And so lo and behold, this is what I've become. And you can all hate venture capitalists too. It's totally allowed here. Having said that, there was a more, let's say, infinite game generative drive behind my decision, which is he became a venture capitalist when I was an undergrad at Stanford. And, educated to me, at least I saw through his eyes, a different way of practicing the business. And you may be experience this as I'm your partner at Digits, which is to actually form a relationship, a real relationship, where you connect with the sense of the whole person who's the entrepreneur, to allow them to reach the limits of their potential and maybe even redefine what those limits are. And he did that because he'd been a CEO. He'd walked in the miles, shoes, whatever, and he understood and empathized, not just in some sort of pathetic way where he just said, oh, I know it's hard, but he really helped understand, like, what most founders in this room don't understand is that your likely cause of death for your company, if you fail, is fatigue. I adore Solomon. I would go to hell and back for Solomon. I was on his board. I think he fatigued of the Docker project, and he moved on his own volition. To me, that's my failure to not have put the conditions in place to have him want to continue to do that. So my dad showed me a different way, which connects more to my sense of purpose, which is to activate the potential of great people. And being born and raised in Silicon Valley, I just was in China last week, and it sort of felt like I was Darwin in the Galapagos, just seeing the adaptive landscape and how dynamic it is. Like, so many more degrees of evolved than the Silicon Valley, but it's China, so the geopolitical situation, everything else going on is sort of flawed. I imagine if you were a European and you came to Silicon Valley, you would feel like I did in China. But I was born here, and I got a sense for this, the adaptive landscape, and I'm passionate about evolution and the mechanisms of evolution, so those things got activated in my educational life, or at least my academic pursuits, and then to be in an ecosystem where that's... What's interesting about the Silicon Valley, just, this is a longer answer than you wanted, but isn't it interesting that if you were to look at probabilities, conditional probabilities, here's a conditional probability statement. If there's a breakthrough technology on planet Earth, what is the likelihood that it gets built out in the Silicon Valley versus anywhere else? I think it's probably 90%. The only thing where you could argue crypto was the last big disruption where we weren't the epicenter, well, because there was no company. There was no, there's Coinbase, which is of course here, although Brian might have moved it to Austin, Texas, God only knows. But so the point is that, like, we have this ecosystem that adapts more quickly, which is why I urge you, if you're a founder, to swim in the waters of the most radical, adaptive, not just opportunistic because we build long-term successes. That's here. And it's not like in Los Angeles. It's not in Portland. Maybe there's pockets of it in Seattle, but when you start to go east, it fades quickly. So yeah, how do you not? So this has been my calling.
No, I love it. So let's dive into the investing strategy. A lot of folks here are first-time or early-stage founders. Many people talk about early-stage investing as you want to find a great team in a large market. Obviously, there's way more to it than that. Yeah. What do you look for that really tells you this is going to be a breakout company?
Yeah, I could put myself in your shoes because I toyed in various points in my past of starting a company, and there are different triggers. For some people, it's I want to be an entrepreneur, so I want to apply to YC because that's what I want to do. For other people, it's there's something I want to manifest in this world that needs to exist, and for other people, it's like fuck authority. Like, I want no part of having a boss, and the only way to do that is to be my own boss, and I'm going to hire people and be their boss. So the motivational triggers are different. I personally find myself attracted to a certain phenotype, by and large. When I think this sort of is scalable and probably relatable to those in the audience, when you touch and you see and you experience the purity of creative drive, of a, this is an overused word in existentialism, but authenticity, where the person couldn't not do it. Like, there's no world in which they could be part of where they weren't pursuing this thing, and they will go to hell and back. That's the first and defining variable, which is this, I don't have a choice, this has chosen me as much as I've chosen it. Yep. The second defining variable I found at the very beginning, if you're starting a company, is you're really creating original thought. And I found that a lot of startups that ultimately don't work, they were playing conceptual bingo, which is like, we need a, look, I tell you, I turned down YouTube because if I go back to the meeting, and there are a lot of reasons to not do YouTube. I'm dating myself. But when they position themselves as, we're the Flickr for video, I thought, why can't you just be YouTube? And in their mind, that was a useful way to help me understand what they were doing. But they were not building Flickr for video. And then, of course, I was friends with Stuart Butterfield, and I'd almost invested in Flickr. And he says, we're going to be the Flickr of video. I'm like, yeah, you're probably going to be the Flickr of video, which is exactly what they were. And YouTube was their own thing. But the idea that, being willing to create a system de novo, not seeking validation, basically getting the feedback from venture capitalists as though we're true idiots, because we are, and saying, if I'm lucky enough to meet somebody who connects with me, that's great, but it's not validation. There's no proof in a VC saying, I like your idea, because I can tell you the shitty things that we've backed, that they fill a universe. Webvan, I'll go to Benchmark, has a number of them. We worked for a while. So there's no validation, but this idea that a lot of people, I was just at Princeton, 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, and I said to the students, you guys are not likely to be founders of great companies. The probabilities are overwhelming against you because you've done well in a system that somebody else created, and you've got an identity from that. You enjoy getting a good grade. Being a founder means there's no one grading you but yourself. There's no higher authority that's giving you a sense of that's a good or bad thing, which maybe you feel that in our board dynamics. But so tapping into that idea that you're on your own, and so there's the authenticity, which is only you can't not do it, but then there's this sort of creative expression, which is you're doing something de novo, and recognize that will be taken away from you if you start to succeed, because then the company starts to build systems where it compounds. Twitter can't go from a star to a heart. And your job as a founder is to always come back to that moment, come back to this beginning, come back to the fresh feeling of the start. And this is why we love Brian Chesky, why we loved Jeff Bezos before he started taking testosterone therapy, why some people like Elon Musk. So,
well, let's dive into Twitter, because we both had a ton of experience there. You invested very, very early. Obviously, the company did some things right and very well, and very interestingly, it also made some sort of fatal mistakes. What's your analysis? What happened with Twitter?
Twitter is, you ask 5 people about it, you'll get 50 explanations as to why it failed. I still believe, even in the current ownership structure with all its challenges, we will most likely be using Twitter. Our grandkids will most likely be using Twitter in 50 years, whatever time frame you want, more likely than Instagram, more likely than Facebook. So what's interesting is the most durable thing to come out of the last 20 plus years, durable in the fullest sense, kind of broke all the rules. Didn't have a product thinker leader in the same way that, say, Snap did. Was more created by the users than the people inside of the company. Yep. And there's another example of this, by the way, that most people in this audience will use today, multiple times.
ChatGPT.
Wikipedia.
Oh, Wikipedia. There we go.
Wikipedia. So It's interesting because Twitter was a phenomenon more than a company. And our efforts to try and build it into a company, they were as if Wikipedia was trying to become a company. Now, we got some things colossally wrong at Twitter. What Wikipedia, I think, got right, people will argue with me, is moderation. And we tried to centralize moderation in a way that I think didn't scale. It always left you in this bad place of either doing too little or too much. And there was a throat to choke. Whose throat are you going to choke at Wikipedia? And so, in a sense, Twitter resisted the commercial efforts that we applied. I could go back. There was many different things that I can point to as sort of failure. It was, as Ali Rogani used to say, we shot it in every major organ at least twice, and we didn't kill it. So, when I go back and say, is there some causal link that could have led to a different? I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, in the sense that the total success may still be in the future for Twitter, and in its current regime and all that, I don't. I mean, it scares me because I feel like, if imagine if Elon owned Wikipedia, right. that would increase the likelihood that it would go away. So I think we've increased the likelihood that it's going to have a fatal moment. That this may be the final fatal organ or critical organ to have been shot. It's prefrontal cortex, but but yeah, Twitter is so many different stories of human drama. The one thing I will say that I can say with some measure of not pride, but just sort of adoration for it is that the people who make Twitter work, which is not really the people inside of the company, those who contribute to it, still have a chance to use it as a network to elevate humanity. And I think that's still in its possibility. And there's still moments we've all had on Twitter that you just say like only on Twitter, and I don't know. So it could have been economically more successful, but maybe that wasn't the point.
Totally fair. Totally fair. All right, I want to get tactical for first-time founders here. So you've obviously met tons of them. They've all come and pitched you. What are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen founders make that you would advise against?
Most of the time we are dealing with personnel. The problems that I end up in my clinic, trauma center, 90% of the time it's personnel issues. And it's tricky because relationships by definition are, dynamic and not mono-dimensional. So I think you have this classic set of first time founders, like the likelihood you come back and say to me, if I invested in you in 3 years, like the biggest mistake I made, followed by person X. But that's the game. And I think you shouldn't assume that you're unique in that. And I think it's more like, how do you want to relate to the people that you're working with, and they're great, where there are great peaks, there are great valleys. I think one of the classic mistakes, top 3 mistakes that I think most founders I work with, I try and help with, is self-awareness. One of the worst things you can activate in the CEO founder role is defense mechanisms, which shut you down and prevent you from, your little protector gets online and you stop hearing feedback and you try and manage people, and I try to decommission your protector, who does wonderful things probably as you were growing up, protected you from situations. But in a company, a founder needs to be self-aware and open. And I think when you're particularly when you're in a relationally stressed dynamic, you shut down and then you start to become more the victim, and you blame your co-founders, you blame this person. That's one track to the personnel stuff. The second, and this is more systemic. By the way, I think the world of Jeff Bezos. He says this 100 times, but it's better to be customer obsessed than competitor obsessed. And one of the many challenges we face, for example, even at Twitter, when you start to develop your strategy in the rearview mirror, you miss the point, which is that you exist to create something unique in the universe. And if a competitor's doing it, you should say, fine, that's great, let them do it. And if they're filling that need, you don't lose. You have pressure to adapt in a way that's allowing you to uniquely serve a customer. So the more you become customer obsessed, that is your truth, the more everything else sorts. And I think oftentimes founders lose sight of this. One of the classic mistakes I run into is that, particularly as companies get a little bigger, and the personnel issues get more geometric, then it's like, well, we're doing this wrong, we're doing that wrong, and this competitor, and I'm like, when's the last time you really looked at the product with fresh eyes? Have you tried going in as a new user?
Yep.
And then, oh my God, we're shipping our org chart, and our experiences are awful. How could I let this happen? Well, because you got caught up on the wrong stuff. So the major challenge as a startup founder and as a CEO who's scaling is focus. And the men, on what? It's always the top 3 things, typically. And the most important of those 3 things must always be the customer. And it sounds so easy to say it, but to do it is, when's the last time you did it? You probably, yesterday.
Yeah, we go through our product sign up every week.
It makes you angry.
Yep.
You're like, how could we be putting a fork into our customers' eyes like this? And that's the truth. And so you go back and you fix it. But don't lose sight of that. And as you scale, the personnel issues end up being the reason you think, well, because I got a terrible head of product. I'm like, oh.
All right, I want to talk about boards, because I have to say I've been on about half a dozen boards, including my own companies. I got to see Twitter's board, a couple other boards I've been on. You're by far the most effective board member I've ever seen. I'm curious how you learned your style. What makes for you an effective board, and how do you add value in that?
Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying that. I like anybody, it's hard to hear a compliment because you feel like you could do better, like Toby, What I think is important for every director is to ask themselves the question of, how do I make the company better? And honestly, I think a lot of directors never vulnerable to understand how they might hurt the company, as well as how they might help make it better, because they're directors, they have money, they have power. And I've come into this not with the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm, but it's to have an internal dialogue and some measure of feedback loop of like, am I really making it better? Am I making it better for the team, the entrepreneur, the opportunity, and ultimately the person that the company is serving? And I found that the most effective way in my own style to do that is to be in a dialectic with my teams. And I've witnessed so much harm. One of our competitors, whom I admire, came into a company because they had a margin problem and said, you have a fucking margin problem. You better fix your margins or you won't be in business. So this company stopped development on the feature set to fix the margin problem and lost all the momentum. Everybody moved on to the next company. And they're like, we should have never listened to that advice. I'm like, here's another way of framing the question, or framing the feedback, which is my ethic, is to say, how do you think about the trade-off of a feature release versus a margin improvement for the overall health of the business? And what's the internal dynamic you have? And it's like, because that relies on like, what's the cost of capital? Will it be easy to raise around if we're growing and we can, prove that people love what we're doing and then deal with the margin problem later? Or so everything I come back to, and I think about this as two mechanisms of which we use in our board meeting, is to try and avoid, and I have crossed this line, and I will again, I'm sure, on your board, to always step back from the prescription, the declaration, and reframe it as a constructive question. And if I've had a good board meeting, those founders come away and say, that was the question we should have been asking about the business, and my God, now we have this vista we've just unveiled that we can go figure out, as opposed to me giving the answer.
Yep.
And then, the second is to avoid the very common pattern that most of you will fall into of having the board meeting be a presentation. And that is not the point of a board meeting. If you want to have a product presentation, if you want to great, do that. Board meetings are discussions. Yep. And the only way you have a discussion is if you have a narrative, a written document, something that we can read beforehand, so we come to it and say, okay, let's engage substantively on the questions that are in front of us. And it's amazing to me how rare that is. And I mean, look, okay, I've been to like 5,000 board meetings in my career, of which like average board meeting with slides has 70 fucking slides. So multiply that, and like, I'm done. And it's my first thing. And I do have one prescription. It's like, no slides.
And this is literally what you told me the first day, basically, of Digits. Like, no slides in the board meeting. You have to send a pre-read a week in advance. It'll just be a 2-hour discussion.
Yeah.
And it's been fantastic. And I would say of that 2-hour discussion, you would think, though, there's like 20 topics we cover. No, it turns out there's one question, basically, that matters each time.
There is typically, as you think about the conscious mind, we can't multitask 50 things that are, so you pick the thing that matters most. You create space for that. You oftentimes in the board dialectic, I will take a point of view that I don't actually agree with, because sometimes you get so fixed in your thinking and you become rigid, and just loosening it up and widening your that's needed, even if like you end up with the same answer, now you have more conviction about it.
So I want to end, we have a couple minutes left, with basically the macro environment. There's two things happening. We're in this amazing AI hype wave, maybe bubble. There's just a massive amount of startup activity around it, while at the same time there's a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty. What's your advice for founders to navigate this period?
It's much better to be a founder now than I'd say 4 years ago or 5 years ago. There's two populations of companies. If you look at the title of this, zombies, unicorn zombies, I'll speak to that. I don't want to run out of time doing this. But it turns out one of the worst things that you could have had happen to you was to start a company that did okay in 2019. Because you could raise money in 21, a shit ton of money. And then by the time you got to 2022, you sort of did okay. And then humanity invented fire, or the proverbial equivalent of that. And you're like, probably should, if we're trying to cook with solar rays, we might want to use that fire. No, we can't use that fire thing because it's a complete different thing than so then you get locked in. There's I think 1,000 companies that are unicorns that were started before AI that are in this terrible locked-in scenario. Digits, bless your heart, built a whole bunch of technology, but we had the freedom of not actually having a business to protect.
Yep.
No offense, but it was like,
it's great.
I said, thank God you don't have any revenue. Like, isn't that bad now? I'm like, no. Like, you can go build Waymo for accounting and build a radically better product experience with fresh eyes, but you've been obsessing on the same problem, fresh eyes of AI, but on the same end user joy. And why would you ever use anything but Digits? It's crazy. You'll see, those of you who start a company like, but people did, but if we had been successful and we were like bench or pilot, and we got like 1,000 customers on a shitty old business model. We've been trapped and sold for parts. So my advice right now is like to be a founder, just go. The macro environment we never worry about because we don't like, I don't know, is it raining outside? It's, you know, you don't time founding. What you respond in terms of macro, you time it, you respond to the call. And the most important advice I have for people founding companies, it's so simple and stupid, it's just start. Is that take the first step. And you'd be surprised how that one step either compounds in a direction or fizzles out. It doesn't matter. But we have so much fear that prevents us from like, well, I don't want to do that because I might not be, yeah, just go. And yeah, get in the market. So.
Peter Fenton, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.